For everyone that is here live today joining us, this is our very first lesson of the new Conchas y Café series. This is officially marking the beginning of our Volume 8, Issue number 3 themed series, looking at the theme of language. And we are doing lesson number 1 here, Elena. Hopefully that answers your question there. And yeah, issue number 3, language, as Abraham has indicated in the chat. And to get us going with our actual lesson for today, like usual, this is our quote of the day. And it comes from Brice Parain, who is a French philosopher and essayist born on the 10th of March in 1897 and passed away the 20th of March in 1971. Brice Parain, or Brice Parain, is, I guess you would pronounce his name. I'm sorry if I got that totally wrong. Aquí está citado como diciendo, el lenguaje es el umbral del silencio. Language is the threshold of silence. And as is our custom, I like to get the discussion going. I'm going to put the quote here in the chat. ¿Cómo les parece lo que dice Brice? Brice Parain. What are your first thoughts as you read what is said? Feel free to raise your hand. You could just chime in. You can unmute yourself. That is totally okay. See, looks like Claudia in the chat writes thoughts. Look up what threshold means. That's probably a good observation. If in case you're not sure what a threshold is, it's that space between, if you think of it like a door, right? A doorway, a threshold would be the doorway. It's the space in between two spaces. El umbral, para los que no sepan, es como aquel espacio entre dos lugares, dos espacios, como la puerta. So what does this quote say to you? Abraham?
Well, definitely, it's that moment when silence stop being silent and we speak, right? Mm-hmm. And that's kind of what was referring to, that moment when we stop being just the self, I think, and we express to the outside. I think that's what it means.
Yeah, I like that. That moment when we express ourselves to the outside, it's no longer interior. It's good. I like that. ¿Alguien más?
I just have found myself trying to go in the opposite direction, and it's not that easy a threshold to cross.
Yeah. Yeah, it's well, I mean, right, coincidentally, we were talking about meditation and the distraction of objects, right? And I think that in some ways, if you're trying to find that silence, language could be a distraction for sure. Back into the package. Trying to go back into the package. Is that what you're saying, Abraham?
Just what Lucy's doing is trying to go from the outside into the inside.
Back in, yeah. Well, my grandson, he's struggling with language. He's using a lot of body language to make up for the fact that that the verbal isn't coming as quickly as he wants it to. But it's definitely a huge leap. I see him struggling, and the frustration of not being able to express himself is huge. So yeah, it's imagine it takes just a lot of development in the brain to get to where we are, anyways, able to communicate.
Yeah, that's an interesting observation, right? Because language is not just words, right? It's also a lot of other things that include things like body language, intonation. It's one thing to say yes. It's another thing to say yeah. It's another thing to say sure, right? Like your intonations can really change the meaning of a word or the meaning of anything. So yeah, it's a very good observation. In the chat, Claudia wrote, why does it have to be language? Why not words? Why not communication? I think those are very valid questions. Why is it that it's language is the threshold of silence? Abraham, raise your
I'll
hand.
just go back to Lou's experience with her nephew, or what was it?
Grandson.
Oh, grandson. Okay.
Grandson,
Didn't
yeah.
want to age you there, but you did yourself.
Hey. I'm there.
Yeah.
I accept it now. It's
Yeah, it's baby language is something really interesting because it kind of it's in between of how to communicate and more efficiently after they start actually how to speak. And yeah, it's fascinating when you see them, the frustration of kids trying to say something and even throwing tantrums because they didn't know how to say, oh, I want more of these, or I want you to stop doing that. But because they don't have the words to say from what they feel to what we should know they feel. And that's the really interesting connection.
big tantrums.
Yeah. My nephew, who is 5 years old now, I remember when he was a year old and still learning how to express himself, right? And it just like you, Miss Luz, I noticed that it was the frustration of not being able to communicate in a way. So you would see it in the body language, which I think is a really interesting thing to go back to what Claudia was saying about, why is it language and not words or communication as the threshold of silence? And if I were to guess, it's language is that space in between silence and breaking silence, probably because, there's still a way to communicate even without words, right? Without the sounds that are going to eventually break the silence. So language as like a system, language as a set of things that we can do that sort of live between the breaking of silence and then internal silence, then that could be maybe where this quote is sort of coming from. The concept of language as a tool to exist between spaces. That might be what Bryce Pine is getting at. Maybe. Any other thoughts from anyone else? Abraham writes in the chat, language is a structured system of communication that consists of grammar and vocabulary. It is the primary means by which humans convey meaning, both in spoken and written forms, and may also be conveyed through sign languages. Exactly. Yeah. So language itself, if we kind of look back at what the theme is here, language can be a lot of different forms of communication, right? It can be a physical form of communication. It could be an oral form of communication. And obviously it can be a written form of communication, which is exactly what we're doing here. Language as the threshold of silence can literally mean, it is what is communicating without any kind of sound. But when we talk about language, it's also really important that we talk about the first thing that we see here, right, which is linguistics. La lingüística es el estudio del habla humano, incluso las unidades, la naturaleza, estructura y modificación del lenguaje. That's kind of a key word right there, the modification. All right, linguistics is a science. It is the study of human speech, and it's all of the different components that make up human speech, including the modification of language. So we are able to modify language not only through the physical way in which we speak, right? We can create sign language, we can interpret body language, but it's also the most basic thing, which is sound. So we're going to start kind of there, where everything begins in terms of what language is. And in linguistics, there is a specific term that relates to sound, which is the phoneme. That is the smallest part of what makes up language as we understand it in terms of spoken language. A phoneme or el fonema is any of the abstract units of the phonetic system of a language, right? So we're talking about a larger system, and the single phoneme is what basically corresponds to a single sound, kind of like the example that you see here, the k of cool or the k of keel, right? There are two different ways in which our tongue makes a sound against the roof of our mouth. The cool is different from the keel. Keel, if you practice it enough, you'll start to really become self-aware of the way in which your tongue moves inside of your mouth. And that is what makes the phoneme k. There's also phonemes like s, e, s, so there's different phonemes that correspond to a specific sound that we make for a whole variety of words. It's not necessarily the spelling, it's the pronunciation. That is what makes a phoneme. Igual como en el español, ¿verdad? Hay dos tipos o dos formas para pronunciar la letra S y la letra C. El fonema, en este caso, sería social o ciencia, ¿verdad? Porque ambas palabras tienen el mismo sonido que utilizan para pronunciar la palabra. El s de social o ciencia, ambas palabras tienen el mismo fonema. Does that make sense to everyone? Are we following along so far? So we're talking about just the most basic part of language, which is the sounds that we make. All right, I got a thumbs up there. So that brings me to then what we call the onomatopoeia. And this has got to be probably one of the most difficult words to spell. But here it is spelled correctly for us, so we can always reference it if we need to. But the onomatopoeia is, as you see here, the naming of a thing or action by vocal imitation of the sound that is associated with it, such as the word buzz, hiss, boom. And there's a whole lot more. Zap, biff, pow. Think of the old 60s era Batman TV show, if you were fortunate enough to watch that, right? All of those little sound effects, clap, bam. All of those little sound effects that you would see flash up on the screen when they were in fights and fist fights, those would be considered onomatopoeias. En español, es un poquito más difícil adecuadamente enseñarles onomatopeya, pero hay ciertas palabras que sí son onomatopeyas. Incluso tenemos aquí tic-tac, piu o boom. Piu como el piu-piu de un pajarito, right? Or tic-tac, it's not tic-tac, it's tic-tac, like the sound of a clock in Spanish, tic-tac. Or turun-turun, yeah, that's another one. Or like a lot of times, growing up learning Spanish, you might have heard, el miau, ¿verdad? El maullar de un gato es el miau miau, o el guau guau, el ladrido de un perro, el guau guau, la vaca mu. Yeah. So, like there's different ways in which we replicate sounds that usually come from nature or from, some sort of man-made sound that we just can't necessarily describe in a very specific way other than by naming it the sound, like the buzz of a bee. It's just, that's how we came to the word. And as you can see here, with the longer explanation of what an onomatopoeia is, it comes from the Greek onoma, which means name, and I'm going to probably mispronounce this, but poin, which means to make. right? And I thought it was interesting to see that poem is also the root of poem and poet, right? So kind of cool, right? We are makers, and a poem is making, or like a creation. So I think that's kind of cool. Fun little extra fact there, right? The term itself, onomatopoeia, is only actually introduced into the English language, or other languages, until the 1500s, believe it or not. Before that, this word did not exist. It was created to basically describe the fact that we have words that we have created as societies, as humans, that are representative of a sound that we hear. And because it's ultimately a sound that we hear, and that is what we end up calling it, linguists actually theorize, as you can see here, that language originated with the imitation of natural sounds. So if you think about it, the most basic way in which we have broken the silence is by ultimately using imitation, right, to describe the things that we were trying to communicate about. So I think that's a very interesting thing for us to consider. Poetry, language, basically the fact that we can all speak, and we have that privilege of speaking. That's all because at some point in our history as human beings, we all found it necessary to break the silence, to pass that threshold of language, and ultimately create what we now know as words. So, any thoughts or questions so far? Is everybody kind of following along? Getting Abraham?
Hold on a second. Well, just because when we're talking about this class, we had a question, and the question is the one I'm going to put in the chat. What is the proper way to spell the sound of fart? And so I just found it. And again, I think it's going to help us to know that everything is spelled the same. It could be different ways of spelling things. And this is a couple of ones that I found. Hopefully I can put them. It's going to take me some time, but here's one way of putting it. That one. Then I don't know, toot. That sounds weird, but that's another way of putting it.
Yeah.
And so on.
Yeah. If you have the luxury of speaking more than one or two languages, then you actually have a whole lot of other ways in which you can describe some of these sounds, right? And there's also, the luxury of being able to code switch, right? We're able to sometimes communicate things better in one language than we can in another language. And that is a superpower, if you ask me. It's something that allows anyone that is bilingual or a polyglot, as the term is, that's something that we can exercise, especially in this class. So definitely feel free to put in words and things that or that you are aware of that allow you to express yourself in a more accurate way. You have that permission here, even if it is just different ways to spell out a fart. So thank you, Abraham, for sharing all the multitude of ways in which you can spell out a fart. Ahora, para practicar un poco, para ojalá mejor entender lo que es un onomatopeia, hay que leer un poco de poesía. Tonight, to sort of see onomatopoeia in action, we're going to read two different poems, one in English and one in Spanish. I didn't translate the Spanish one for us, and I didn't translate the English one in Spanish either. Pero ojalá aquí tienen un buen ejemplo o un par de ejemplos para que entiendan mejor lo que es un onomatopeia. And I'd like to perhaps ask a volunteer to read for me. So, cualquiera de las dos, si hay algún voluntario por ahí que gustaría leer, you have your choice at this moment. Abraham?
I can do the Spanish one, but I'm waiting for somebody to take the English then.
All right. All right, we got Roots. Roots, go ahead and you can start us off with the English, and then Abraham, you can do the Spanish.
Okay. Weather by Eve Miriam. Dot a dot dot, dot a dot dot. Spotting the window pane. Spack a spack speck. Flick a flack fleck. Freckling the window pane. Excuse me, a splatter, a scatter, a wet cat, a clatter, a splatter, a rumble outside, umbrella, 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 bumbershoot, barrel of rain, slosh, a galosh, slosh, a galosh, slither and slather, a glide, a puddle, a jump, a puddle, a jump, a puddle, a jump, puddle splosh. A juddle, a pump, a luddle, a dump, a puddle, muddle, jump in a slide.
Excellent. Thank you, Roots. You know, for me, that particular poem really sounded a lot like something that I would have read when I was little. So I'm glad that we had a junior participant in the background there listening. All right. Abraham, ahora te toca a ti.
That was a good one, Ruth. Nocturnos por Juan Larrea. Larrea? Wow, first time I heard that one. Okay. La noche ha abierto su paraguas. Llueve, los pájaros de la lluvia picotean los trigos de los charcos. Los árboles duermen sobre una pata. Revoloteos, revoloteos. Destartala un coche. Su estrepito final de endecasilado. What is that? Encasilado?
Decasílabo.
What is it?
Well, just continue and then we'll.
Anyways, un hombre cruza con un mal pensamiento. Los mosquitos de agua colmenean las luces, incendios de los revoloteos, llueve.
Excellent. Thank you, Abraham. So, in the casílabo, if I remember correctly, is the Spanish word for a staccato. So it's like a kind of like a shrill sound. So, ¿qué piensan? What are your first reactions to these poems? I see a hand raised from Abraham.
Well, first, the first one has like a more of the word that we're looking, the onomatopoeia, because of the last part. It has a lot of it. The second one, it feels like more the actual words that are made for that kind of a specific action or sound. So yeah, that's the only difference that I see between those two. But yeah, the first one is a tricky one.
It's a tricky one because of, you know, it having words that are basically made up, right? It's kind of the difficult part about creating an onomatopoeia, is that you have to be creative in the way in which you use your phonemes to create a sound, right? Even if that means that a word doesn't exist already. Although I do have to say, if we look at the Spanish one and really think about the words that we see in Spanish, are they onomatopoeias? Or are they words because they were first an onomatopoeia and we just decided to adopt them as words?
They sound like they tried to begin with the word, that the way the things sound, but then it evolved into an actual word later.
I think that in Spanish, that is definitely, I think, how it developed over time, for sure.
Which words in Spanish are you referring to?
Well, I think that if we were to maybe look at the Spanish one and think of words like revoloteos, right? What does that mean? Well, it means when a bird basically is fluffing their feathers, right? But how did we come to that word? If we think about the sound that a bird makes when it does that, when it fluffs its feathers, when it flaps its wings, it kind of sounds like the word, doesn't it? I mean, I would argue that it makes that sound.
I see what you mean now.
Yeah. Or like picotear. Right? What does it mean to picotear? Well, it's when a bird picks at something with its beak, right? Con su pico. Right? But that's, I mean, how can we better describe that sound that is made? Like pico, 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 pico. You know, picotear, right? Picotean. Or charcos, right? A charco is a puddle. But what sound does a puddle make? We can only reference the sound by stepping in the puddle. And if you've had the misfortune of stepping in a puddle, kind of sounds like charco, right? Because that's the sound of water splashing in a small body. So if we think about the Spanish, you know, and it's a poem about the rain, I would argue that it's an onomatopoeia, even if it is an existing word. Just like the word boom, right? Boom, B-O-O-M, in English and in Spanish, it's a sound, but it's also an accepted word. It's an accepted spelling of that particular sound. That's ultimately what an onomatopoeia is.
Thank you. That makes a lot more sense now.
You're welcome. So here, why don't we do this? I'll read the poems again one more time for us and think about, you know, what are the words that are being used, or what are the sounds that are being used to represent the moment? And I'll try to answer the question there afterwards. So first, let's start off with Weather by Eve Miriam. Dot, a dot, 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 a dot, dot, spotting the window pane. Spack, a spack, speck, flick, a flack, fleck, freckling the window pane. A spatter, a scatter, a wet cat, a clatter, a splatter, a rumble outside. Umbrella, 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 bumbershoot barrel of rain. Slosh a galosh, slither and slather, a glide. A puddle, a jump, a puddle, a jump, a puddle, a jump, puddle, splush. A juttle, a pump, a luddle, a dump, a pudmuddle, jump in and slide. Y ahora Nocturnos, por Juan Larrea. La noche ha abierto su paraguas, llueve. Los pájaros de la lluvia picotean los trigos de los charcos. Los árboles duermen sobre una pata, revoloteos, revoloteos. Destartala un coche su estrépito final en decasílabo. Un hombre cruza como un mal pensamiento. Los mosquitos de agua colmenean las luces, incendios de alas, revoloteos, llueve. So, what sounds stood out to you as you listened to the poems? I see. Dot, flick. Okay. If the word exists as long as it symbolizes sound. So to answer Diana's question about an exception, I guess you could call it an exception in the sense of like the word slosh, right? Abraham just put the word slosh in the chat. Slosh is an accepted spelling for the concept of water or some sort of liquid moving around vigorously, right? It's a sound that water makes as you like shake it inside of a cup. If I were to slosh my tea right now, you would hear slosh, 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 right? If it was a big enough bottle or of water, right? So slosh eventually, even though it was an onomatopoeia, it eventually became an accepted word to describe the thing that it's describing, right? That's essentially what an onomatopoeia is. Just like charco, if you think about it, a charco, the sound that a charco makes is charco, right? If you step in it, and that's the only way we can best describe a puddle in Spanish, un charco. So it became the word for the sound or for the, action that it was meant to describe originally. Does that help? Does that make sense? Yeah.
Yes, thank you.
Let's see. We have also roots, dot, slash, galosh, charco, revoloteo, chop, I think would be another, says Abraham. Yeah, chop, chopping is the action of, right, cutting something. Splatter, clatter. Splatter is an accepted spelling for the action of water hitting something, right? Like being spread out in a uncontrolled way. Clatter is an accepted spelling for the sound of things falling. So yeah, I think you guys are starting to get it. All right, some words are accepted spellings of a sound or an action. But we also have the opportunity to make it up, right? Because ultimately all language is made up. All words and actions that, are, sorry, not actions, but all words and all parts of language that we use to communicate, all of that was made up at one point. It's just our best guess, I suppose, as how to describe something. So how's everyone feeling for the moment? Slather. That's a good one. Slather. Yeah. Thank you, Ms. Luz. All right. So if everyone is feeling good, then let's move on to our little exercise. So I'm assuming that you probably already know, but this is going to be an exercise in creating your own onomatopoeias. Now, keep in mind, if it's a word that already exists, you are welcome to use that. But, think about the phoneme, right? The phoneme, the most basic sound of any word. If it's going to help you better describe what you hear, then feel free to create your own words. But, on a separate piece of paper, or, if you're feeling adventurous and you want to, share already in the chat, I'd like you to place yourself in an everyday moment. And without naming the object or objects that make the sounds that you hear, describe what you hear using only the sounds that are made. Spell out the sounds you hear. Now, if you have a lot going on in the background now, wherever you are, then feel free to, use that background noise, right? Try to describe it with just the sounds that it's making. Turn that into a letter or a series of letters that best describe the sounds that you are experiencing. Para los que están escuchando en español, imagínate en un momento cotidiano, sea el ritual de hacer un café en las mañanas. Y sin nombrar los objetos que hacen los sonidos que se escuchan, describe lo que escuchas usando solo los sonidos que se oyen. Deletrea los sonidos. Usa las letras, el pedazo más fundamental del lenguaje. Usa los sonidos para luego interpretar lo que se oye. That's perfect. Diana gave us a great example there of a siren. Wee-oo, wee-oo, wee-oo. Excellent. Couldn't ask for a better example. So ahí tienen. Sigan con el ejercicio. Really try to come up with as many sounds that you might hear in whatever everyday moment you live. Like I said, if it's the ritual of making coffee, try to describe the sound of the grinder grinding your beans, or the sound of the water percolating in the percolator. And it will take about, let's say, 5 minutes. I'll give you 5 minutes to write down as many sounds as you can imagine or as you can hear in your everyday moment. All right, and we are back. So I hope you all had fun and, practicing this little exercise in onomatopoeia. I saw in the chat that we had some pretty good phonemic or phonetic descriptions of sounds. I'm kind of curious to hear what some of them were. And of course, Abraham, had to just go all in on the the poem already. So good job to Abraham. So yeah, anybody want to describe for us any of the sounds that they attempted to describe in the chat, just to give some insight onto how you came to those particular sounds? Maybe Diana, you want to start us off?
Can I go next? Sorry, I'm real quick.
Yeah, sure.
I'll go after someone else.
All right. Well, Abraham, since you already presented to us a short little mini story / poem, you want to get us going with what you were trying to represent?
Well, first it was the sound basically of your fingers or knuckles cracking.
Mm-hmm.
And then the next one is, what was it? I don't know. I'm trying to find out where I wrote this. Okay, the next one is, of course, like the cartoons, like, the bam in the face. The last one is basically the sound of a body hitting the ground, but in a kind of like a sack of potatoes kind of sound, a little more like a blobby. Yeah. Because it's different sounds that even if it's the same action, it depends on how exactly it goes sound.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think that's kind of a cool way to describe the sound of a body hitting the floor, right? The plum, which that's how I'm reading it, right? But a person could also read plum, right? And the pronunciation can obviously change also the effect. So yeah.
Yeah, and I like that you put the emphasis at the end, because that's what I wanted. Like lump, and at the end is when you get the big sound.
Yeah, exactly. Let's see, Claudia, you also gave us a pretty good list there right after Abraham. Would you like to share with us your inspiration? On the bus a lot, and every morning I'm late and listen if I've been left behind, but it was hard to describe, so I went with a car taking off, and the bus turning signal. I like that. That's good. That's good. All right. Let's see, Diana, and then Miss Luz.
Okay, so I did hold on. It's like, to me it sounded like the birds chirping every morning, like when they wake me up. Like there's a big tree next to my window. To me, I guess that's how I listen to it. And then the second one, the shoo, it's when the wind is very strong. Like when it's very strong, I guess you can say when it's angry, it makes like this type of whistling noise. If you really pay attention to it, it makes like a really strong whistling noise.
Mm-hmm. Okay. And that's where the ututu.
No, the tutu, that was the birds chirping.
Oh, okay.
Thanks for the sound effects. I love it.
Yeah. I mean, in the end, yeah, like this is kind of like trying to spell out a sound effect in the end.
Yeah.
Yeah. Good job. Good job.
You're welcome.
All right. And then Miss Luz.
I didn't finish typing it all in, but it starts with chilling, chilling, click, glunk, bam, vroom, vroom, ear, la, 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 lero, 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 blah, blah, blah. Tick, tick, tick. Pra, 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 pra. Swish, 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 swish. Take a guess.
Sounds like a kind of like driving in the rain, I want to say.
Yeah. Getting into my car.
Getting into the car.
Starting the car, removing the club off my car, closing the door, starting the car, taking off, then listening to the radio and the blah blah blah. and then putting my signal light, and then it starts raining. So
Nice, nice. Took us through the entire sequence of sound effects. I like it.
yeah, it was fun.
Yeah, good, good. I think the car needs a mechanic.
It's getting pretty old.
That's messed up, man. All right, and then we have, let's see, in the chat, looks like the next was roots. It takes a minute to splash out hot. I like my dishes extra clean. Whoosh, the water crashes against my dishes, washing away the grease. Drip, 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 undone. Nice. Took us through the entire process of washing dishes. That's good. I definitely like this. I think that's a good sound effect, right? For the sound of opening the tap, having water come out. So it's good. Anything else to add? Anyone? Any questions? Abraham?
Well, since we're talking about Luz's car, I noticed because we're talking about sounds. My brother got a new car. I think it's like a hybrid, and it has this weird sound when it goes in reverse or gets there. Like I don't know. It's like the Jetsons is the ones that the cartoon, but a little more creepy. Like wow, it always creeps me up. It's a new sound of cars. Ugh.
Yeah. My girlfriend used to have a Prius when I first met her, and the sound of the Prius definitely is it's a unique sound that it makes. And there are some electric cars or hybrids that have an even stronger sound. Obviously, that's for helping people who are either blind or have a visual impairment, right? They can at least hear for the sound of an approaching vehicle. So that's part of the reason why some of those sounds were created. They're not even the actual sound of the motor itself, but
Yeah.
But yeah, I mean that's an interesting observation to make, right? We as humans, because a vast majority of us are privileged enough to have all five senses, in terms of our physical senses. We sometimes take sound for granted, but in all forms of language, whether it be body language, whether it be spoken language, or it be written language, we actually are interacting with sound all the time, whether we recognize it or not. So part of what onomatopoeia is ultimately trying to do for us is it's trying to spell out the sounds that we hear every day. And when we realize ultimately that all language, written language especially, is just our way of describing the everyday occurrences that we experience, everything begins to sort of kind of come together, I think, because a lot of times we take language for granted. We take for granted our ability to speak and our ability to hear. And I hope that, as you work through this particular exercise into the following week, that you really start to sort of absorb your surroundings, right? Really start to take in everything that you experience on a regular basis. And I hope that does eventually, inspire you to write a new poem. And with that said, guess what your homework is for this week? Basically, building off of this exercise that you just did, your homework is, using onomatopoeia, craft a poem that replicates the sounds of an everyday occurrence in your life. Y en español aquí les tengo su tarea. Usando onomatopoeia, elabora un poema que replica los sonidos de una ocurrencia cotidiana en tu vida. Cualquier cosa que sea, intenta usar sonidos, sobre todo para describir el proceso de levantarse, el proceso de hacer su café, el proceso de ir al trabajo. There's obviously a lot of different everyday occurrences that happen. and each one of them has a unique sound to it. So really challenge yourself to think about those sounds and try to translate those sounds into the actions that you would take in any given moment. Taking inspiration from the poems that we read today, you can obviously choose to go a more onomatopoeic direction, like with this one that is about rainfall and splashing in puddles. Or you can choose to use words, especially if you are polyglot, if you speak more than one language. You can definitely use words that best describe the sounds that you hear, as is the case in Nocturnos, with all of the different words that in some way ended up becoming, a recognized word, right? An onomatopoeia. So, does anyone have any questions about your homework for this week? No. All right. I don't see any further questions in the chat or anything else. So, with that said, I will. Good question. So Claudia asks in the chat, how do we define poem? Well, a poem can be pretty much anything. Poetry can take a lot of forms. It could take a lot of shapes. There is such a thing as prose poems, where it's written just like a paragraph, but it has poetic influence. You can write kind of like the poem Weather by Eve Merriam, who we read. It's just a collection of sounds and some words that give us the impression of, a rainy day and jumping in puddles. So poem is sort of open to interpretation, if that helps. The idea really is, though, to be, intentional in the way that you describe this everyday event. And if it has some element of self-reflection, all the better. Abraham?
Well, just by looking at this, I was like, oh, maybe a good example would have been also Edgar Allan Poe, The Telltale Heart. So I'm looking, maybe that he used like a sound for the heart thing, but I think he's more like using words than an onomatopoeia. Like, he missed the chance. Because I love when I find like the sound being spelled like correctly. You're like, oh, that's how you would write or something, right?
Yeah.
I love when I find, but no, it seems like he didn't use that. It's more like the actual words. Damn it.
Not in that one, but he does actually, he is known for using onomatopoeia in some of his poetry.
Yeah, I was looking into it like, oh, wow, maybe I can find it.
And, I think it's also important for us to be clear about the fact that when it comes to sounds, there is no right or wrong way to spell a sound, right? A sound effect is going to sound however it is that you want it to sound, in terms of the way that it's written. Just like Abraham used the word plum, Plum, right, to replicate the sound of a body hitting the floor, the plum, right? That's entirely Abraham's choice, and it's Abraham's way of understanding the sound. And luckily, because of the context in which Abraham used the word plum, we were able to generally understand that it was a sound effect and not the actual fruit, the plum. Right? So that's important to also remember. So you have a lot of liberty here. If you have a lot of freedom, don't be afraid of the freedom. Just take it as an opportunity to define for yourself what a sound is. And just remember, when it comes to language, the most basic elements of language are the sounds that letters make. Just like we were talking about at the beginning, the S in social in Spanish and the C in ciencia, they're the same sound. They're just spelled with two different letters. Or like close and keel, in our English example, right? Close, spelled with a C, and keel, spelled with a K. The sound is still k. And so it's up to you. It's entirely up to you how you want to use the most core elemental parts of language to express yourself in this one. Any final questions or comments? All right. Well, if that's all for tonight, then we will call it a night. So thank you everyone for sharing. Maybe some other day I'll talk about my radio show and my DJ experience, as we were briefly chatting about in the chat. So take care, everybody. Have a good night, and we'll see you all next week for
Thank you.
our first workshopping session.
Good night, everyone.
Good night.